We've already covered creatures that have miraculously survived mortal injuries, but the list of humans to have done so is even greater. One of the most famous cases has to be that of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who survived having an iron bar shot through his head. I will warn you though, this one gets pretty graphic. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Well I Never. Today the story of railroad worker Phineas Gage. Born in Grafton County, New Hampshire, Gage was the eldest of 5 siblings. Beyond that, little is known of his early years. Those who knew him prior to his accident say that he was a healthy, strong and active man. 5'6", muscular and rarely suffered from illness. He was also educated enough to be able to read and write, and it's said he had a strong will. He also had a knack for explosives. It's thought that he may have worked with them on farms and in mines during his youth, and by 1845 he was employing his skills working as a blasting foreman in the construction of the Hudson River Railroad. Explosives have been used in mining and for clearing rock and earth since the 9th century. The practice continues today, where dynamite and other explosives are set and detonated using electrical charges. In Phineas Gage's day, things weren't much different. A hole would be bored into the rock, with the deepest section being filled with blasting powder. Then the rest of the hole would be packed or tamped with sand, clay or any other inert material in order to focus the blast into the surrounding rock. Similar to how a musket or cannon is loaded, the explosives and filler would be compacted down into the borehole with what was known as a tamping iron. These weren't much more than a long iron bar. Phineas had his own custom-made one, however, tapering off at one end much like a small javelin. The day of the accident, September 13th, 1848, began like any other, as Phineas Gage directed a work gang on the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. Towards the end of the day, he began the process of setting an explosive like he had done 1,000 times before. With the explosive set, he began packing the tamping material down into the hole when his attention was drawn to members of his crew working behind him. He turned towards them, inadvertently bringing his head in line with the blast hole, and as he opened his mouth to speak, the tamping iron sparked against the rock, igniting the explosives. With the hole not being fully packed with tamping material, the explosion chose the easiest route out, firing the tamping rod out with fierce speed and power up through the left side of Gage's face. The 3-foot long and 1¼ inch in diameter rod travelled up past the outside of his upper jaw, behind his left eye, and up through the left side of his brain, exiting through the frontal bone portion of his skull. The bar then landed some 25 meters away, smeared with blood and brain matter. Gage was thrown to the ground with his arms and legs giving brief spasms. Within a few minutes, however, he was sat upright and talking, even managing to walk unaided. He was then taken onto the back of an ox cart to the hotel he was staying at in the nearby town. Half an hour later, physician Edward H. Williams arrived on the scene to find Gage sitting in a chair outside of the hotel. Upon seeing him, Gage is reported as saying, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." Edward H. Williams stated that he could see the injury clearly enough even before he left his carriage, the pulsations of the brain being very distinct. The top of the head appeared somewhat like an inverted funnel. As he examined him, Phineas began to explain what had transpired, with the doctor finding it hard to believe. During his explanation, Gage started to feel ill, getting up to vomit. The doctor then states that the effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacupful of brain up through the hole in Gage's head, which then fell upon the floor. Later that day, the case was passed over to a Dr. John Martin Harlow. Along with Dr. Williams, they tended to Gage's wounds, shaving his head and cleaning away coagulated blood and bone fragments, along with an ounce or more of protruding brain. Harlow then replaced 2 large pieces of detached bone and closed the wound in Gage's head using adhesive straps, leaving it partially open for drainage. A wet compress was applied along with a nightcap and further bandaging. He then dressed the wound in his cheek and attended to the burns on Gage's hands and forearms. After being made as comfortable as the doctors could manage, Phineas was asked if he would like to receive visitors. He declined, insisting that he would be back at work in a few days. Up to this point, Gage's reaction to receiving what foremost would be a mortal wound, along with losing a not insignificant amount of brain matter, was nothing short of dumbfounding. The true scale of what had happened would become more apparent to Gage over the coming weeks, however. The following morning, he was still responding well and recognised his mother and uncle, who had travelled 30 miles to see him. The next day, however, it's said that he lost his mind and became delirious. The next few days, his condition dipped and rose, with him eventually coming to his senses and again recognising friends and family. By the 12th day, however, he had entered a semi-comatose state, answering people with monosyllabic responses, growing ever weaker. Beneath the bandages, a fungus had begun to take hold and sprout on his exposed brain, with tissue from his wound breaking down, and that, along with pus being forced out through his mouth, the wound in his head and left eye socket. If he wasn't before, Phineas was now in a very bad way, and preparations were made for his death. Harlow had other plans, however, and set about doing all he could to clean the wound, cutting away the sprouting fungi and applying silver nitrate to disinfect the area. The days continued to pass, with Harlow routinely treating the wound and replacing the dressings, and before long, Gage's state began to improve. 24 days after the accident, he was able to step from his bed to sit in a nearby chair. A month after that, he was up and about regularly, tackling the stairs and leaving the residence. 10 weeks after his encounter with a tamping rod, Gage was able to return to his parents' home in Lebanon, New Hampshire, travelling there in a closed carriage, something normally used for transporting the insane. By this stage, he was said to be quite feeble and thin, weak and childish. Once home, he began to improve further, however, and by February of the following year, he was able to do some light work around the farm, progressing to spending a half-day working in the fields by the summer. Gage did attempt to return to his job in the railroad, but his employers stated that they saw a marked change in his personality. The equilibrium, or balance so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. In this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. Later, in 1849, the professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School, Henry Jacob Bigelow, invited Gage to Boston to see for himself the man who had survived such a massive injury. Gage was then brought before the Boston Society for Medical Improvement and studied further. Unable to return to work on the railroad, Gage capitalized on his newfound notoriety by making several public appearances, charging 12.5 cents per person, along with regularly appearing at Barnum's American Museum in New York. The interest in Gage's story gradually began to subside, and after working for a stable and coach service in New Hampshire, he moved to Chile to work as a long-distance stagecoach driver. He spent 8 years in Chile, working in stables, transporting passengers, and often driving heavily laden coaches drawn by 6 horses. This came to an end in 1859 when his health began to fail, and he returned to live with his mother and sister, who by this point were living in San Francisco. Under their care, he had a brief recovery, but began to suffer epileptic seizures. These would grow in severity and frequency until one day in May 1860, where during a seizure lasting over 5 minutes, Gage passed away. The interest in him did not, however, and 6 years later, Dr. Harlow, the man who had tended to Gage but had lost contact with him over the years, discovered that he had passed and asked the family if he could be granted the skull of the patient to study further. They obliged, and after studying that and the tamping iron, he wrote up a final retrospective of the case before placing the skull and iron on display in the Warren Museum, where it remains to this day. Now, a lot of videos go deep into how much Gage changed post-accident, stating that he became a constantly angry and abusive psychopath, unable to hold down a job and caring little for societal norms. They normally point out that the ones who bore the brunt of rage were his wife and children, though he had neither. There's no doubt that there certainly were changes to his personality post-accident, but the scale and severity of these is uncertain. Though his railroad employers paint a picture of an angry and unfocused oaf, his family say that he became more childlike, with the main effect being to his memory. Going as far as to say that if you didn't know him, you'd be hard-pushed to know he had such a large brain injury. And could an angry brute handle regularly travelling hundreds of miles with paying passengers? The truth is, we may never know the true extent of the changes that Gage's personality underwent. But it is true that those who suffer traumatic brain injuries do often find controlling their emotions becomes difficult. Perhaps, over time, Gage was able to adapt to the changes, with his early angry and vociferous nature being a hangover from his initial recovery. Either way, the story of Phineas Gage is one that will continue to capture the imagination and stand as testament to fortitude of the human body. Thank you for watching, and please hit that subscribe button if you've not already become a subscriber, and thank you for those who already are. Right then, take care, and I'll see you on the next one.